Montana Territory, June 1879. The wind cut sharp through the dry grass as the auctioneer's voice rang out across the yard of the Red Rock trading post. The sun was high, but the girl's arms stayed wrapped tight around her middle like she still felt winter. She stood barefoot on the wooden platform, her dress threadbare, her head bowed. She is 17 strong bones, but the lungs never did take to the cold. Too weak for field work, too slow for house chores, but quiet, does not talk back. Who will take her off the family's hands? No one stepped forward. Then the rancher nudged the auctioneer and added, "She eats too little to be trouble. Her father says she's better off sold than sick." That got a few murmurs. A man with yellowed teeth laughed. "She ain't sick, just lazy. I will take her for $2 and put her to use." The girl did not flinch, but something in her jaw tensed. From the edge of the crowd, a tall cowboy dismounted from a mud-spattered chestnut horse. He was lean, sun-browned, with a scar on his chin and a way of looking at things like he meant to fix them. "I will take her," he said, voice steady. The crowd turned. The cowboy stepped up with coins in hand, 5 silver dollars. "She is not for your fields or your jokes." "I will take her," the seller blinked. "That is more than I know what I said," the cowboy replied. He did not take his eyes off the girl. "Come on, miss." The girl hesitated, then stepped off the platform, her bare feet hitting the dirt with a soft thud. She followed him without a word, not looking back. They rode off before anyone could say more, her seated behind him, arms wrapped around his middle. She did not ask where they were going. His name was Jonah Ellard. He owned a small cattle spread north of Sweetwater Creek, 2 days' ride out. She told him her name by the second campfire. Brielle Vance. He nodded, offering her the last of the beans. She had not eaten much since he took her. She took the tin bowl, hands trembling. "You are not meant for labor," he said, not unkindly. "I can see that plain as day." She glanced up, wary. "Then why did you buy me?" "Because I could not leave you there." She went quiet again, but her shoulders eased just a little. They made it to Jonah's place by dusk on the 3rd day. A small cabin, 1 barn, a dozen head of cattle, and 3 horses. Nothing fancy, but it was clean, well-built, and overlooked a wide stretch of valley. He let her sleep in the cabin while he took the barn loft. When she woke the next morning, a dress and a pair of worn boots sat folded by the foot of her bed. She stepped outside, blinking into the new day. Jonah was hauling water from the creek. He looked up at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into something close to a smile. "Morning, Miss Brielle." "You do not have to call me that." "I do. You deserve to be spoken to with respect." She blinked hard, then sat on the porch steps. Over the next week, she tried to sweep, cook, even saddle one of the horses, but her body would not keep up. The coughing came back, worse when the evenings got cold. She hated it, hated feeling useless. One night, she stood by the barn, face pale in the moonlight. "You should not have bought me. I cannot even earn my keep." Jonah set down the grain sack and walked over slowly. "You are not here to earn anything," he said. "You are here to be safe." Her eyes filled. "Why?" "Because I know what it is like to be tossed away." She looked at him, then not just looked, but saw. The scar on his chin, the way his hands were always half-clenched like he was used to holding on for dear life. "Who tossed you away?" "My folks. Left me with an uncle when I was 8. Did not see them again." She swallowed. "How did you get through it?" "Took me a while to stop thinking I was the problem. But then I met someone who reminded me that being left behind does not mean you are not worth something." She was quiet a long time, then softly, "You remind me of my brother. He used to sit with me when I was sick, tell me stories. He died 3 winters ago." "I am sorry. He would have liked you." Jonah looked down, then back up at her. "I think I would have liked him too." That night, Brielle slept without coughing. She woke to birdsong and sunlight and the smell of fresh bread. Jonah had tried baking. It was terrible, but she laughed anyway. He grinned. "That was the sound I have been waiting for." She blinked. "What? You laughing?" Sounded like spring finally came. From that morning on, something shifted. She stopped trying to prove herself with chores and started simply being present. She read his old books, helped him name a new calf, and once painted wildflowers on the side of the feed shed using leftover whitewash and crushed berries. He watched her more than he admitted. And one afternoon, when she brought him water out by the fence line, she caught him smiling at her like nothing in the world made more sense. She flushed. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just glad you are here." They stood in silence, the sun warm on their backs, the wind soft through the tall grass. She reached for his hand. He held it like it was the most natural thing in the world. The first real rain came in late July. It was a slow, soaking thing that turned the dust to clay and brought the scent of wet earth up through the floorboards. Brielle stood at the front window, watching the drops gather on the sill. Her palms pressed lightly to the glass, like she needed proof of the change. Jonah came in with his coat dripping, his hat slung low over one brow. He peeled off his gloves and set them by the stove. "Creek's high, cattle'll keep to the ridge for now." She didn't turn from the window. "The quiet feels different when it rains." He paused by the table. "Better or worse? I'm not sure yet." He didn't press her, just filled the kettle and set it to boil. That evening, the roof ticked with water and the lantern cast soft gold on the log walls. She sat on the floor, sorting dried beans, a quilt tucked around her legs. He carved a length of pine into fence pegs. Their silences had grown easier, filled with the rhythm of shared time. "You ever think of leaving this place?" she asked, not looking up. He didn't stop carving. "I have, once or twice." "Why didn't you?" "Because some things are worth staying put for." "Even when it's hard," she let that settle. "My mother used to say wind only breaks trees that forget how to bend," she whispered after a while. "That sounds like a woman who knew something of storms." She did. Her fingers stilled on the beans. "She died after my brother." Grief took her quicker than the fever ever did. He set the knife down, quiet. "I don't tell you these things to be pitied." "I know. I tell you because I don't think you'd lie about your own grief." He met her eyes across the low fire. "I wouldn't." There was a pause, long and full. "I thought if I came here I'd feel small," she said. "But I don't. You don't seem small to me." She gave a short breath, close to a laugh. "I was sick more than I was well. My father didn't know what to do with a daughter who couldn't carry a pail or scrub a floor without losing her breath. Then he didn't know what he had." Her gaze lingered on him, steady. "What do you see when you look at me?" He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "I see someone who still chooses to be kind, even after being let down. That's not weakness." The rain eased sometime after midnight. She watched the clouds drift past the window, pale and heavy. In the hush, Jonah's even breathing from the cot across the room was the only sound. She didn't sleep, but she didn't feel tired either. The next morning, the world was silver and green. The grass shimmered like it had been washed clean. Jonah was already outside, mending the line that ran along the north field. She brought him a strip of jerky and a cup of coffee, the enamel chipped at the rim. He took them with a nod, his hands dirt-streaked and sure. "There's a traveling preacher coming through next week," he said between sips, "stopping near the old post road. Folks'll gather for a service. Would you want to go?" "I was thinking you might." She considered that. "I haven't sat in a church since I was 15. Doesn't have to be about the sermon. I don't own anything fit for gatherings." "You have a ribbon," he said gently. "That red one you wore in your braid last week. It would do fine." She flushed and looked down. "I don't know what I'd say to people. I've been away from folks a long time." "You don't have to say much. Just stand beside me." Her breath hitched, surprised by the warmth of those words. "You'd want me to?" His eyes didn't waver. "I would." The next days passed with quiet preparation. She stitched a hem that had come loose, cleaned the boots he'd lent her, practiced holding her shoulders straighter. Not to impress anyone, but because she was beginning to feel like someone who stood upright in the world. On the morning of the gathering, he hitched the wagon instead of saddling the horses. "In case we stay through supper," he said simply. She sat beside him, the ribbon tied in her hair, boots polished as best she could. The air held the scent of late summer sun, warmed pine, damp soil, something sweet from the wild rose blooming along the trail. They didn't speak much on the ride, but they didn't need to. His hand rested on the reins, hers folded in her lap, and the space between them felt full, not empty. As they neared the clearing where wagons gathered and voices lifted in greeting, she reached over, lacing her fingers through his. He didn't look at her, just held her hand firm in his. like it had always belonged there. The preacher's tent was canvas stretched and weather-worn, pitched along the edge of a hayfield where cottonwoods leaned toward the creek. Folks milled about in Sunday shirts and calico, voices low, children darting between wagon wheels. A dog barked once, then settled beneath a bench. Brielle stood close to Jonah, her hand still tucked in his. She didn't speak as they stepped into the shade of the tent, where rows of wooden crates had been set for seating. The air inside was warm with dust and breath. She took in the faces older women with lined cheeks, young men in collarless shirts, a girl no older than 12 with straw-colored braids and bare feet swinging above the dirt. Jonah guided her to a seat near the back. She sat, hands folded, and watched the preacher, a man with a deep crease in his brow and a voice like turned soil, step forward. She didn't follow the sermon. Her mind wandered to the way Jonah's thumb rested on her knuckles, to the way her body had stopped bracing for shame every time someone looked her way. She hadn't expected to feel steadier with people around, but she did. After the final hymn, they trailed out with the others. A woman in a green bonnet offered Brielle a slice of honey bread. She accepted it with a quiet thank you, surprised by how natural the words felt. Jonah led her to a patch of grass beneath a walnut tree. "You held your own in there," he said, sitting beside her. She tore off a piece of the bread. "I was studying how people carry themselves. Most don't seem to think much of it. Most ain't had to think much. You've learned to read rooms the way other folks read trail signs. I don't think I knew how much that took out of me until it stopped being necessary." He leaned back against the trunk, watching the way sunlight filtered through the leaves. "You're steadier now, not just in your eyes. In the way you stand." She looked down at her worn boots. "I didn't think I'd ever feel like my body belonged to me again. It does, fully." She didn't answer right away. "Then, when you bought me, I expected I'd be used like a tool, or worse, I know. But you didn't touch me. You didn't even ask me to serve you." He turned to her, quiet. "You're not a debt to be repaid." She studied him. "Then what am I?" He hesitated, then said plainly, "Someone I want beside me, not behind, not owed, just beside." The wind stirred the tall grass beyond the tree line. She let her fingers graze the bark beside her, grounding herself. "You've never asked what I want," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She nodded slowly. "I want to learn how to make tinctures. My mother used to keep a shelf of them. Elderflower, willow bark, valerian. I remember the smells, but not the steps. There's a woman east of the ridge, old settler named Hattie. She keeps a stillroom, been known to trade knowledge for patience. I'd like that. I'll take you next week." Brielle smiled, not wide, but with a calm that ran deep. Later, they walked the perimeter of the field where cattle grazed beyond the fence. Jonah checked the posts while she trailed her fingers through the tall stems of goldenrod. A rabbit darted out, causing her to laugh in surprise. "You've got a good laugh," he said, eyes on the fence wire. "I forgot I had one." "Good things can return." She stopped walking. "Do you believe that?" "I do. I've seen it with my own eyes." She stepped closer, voice low. "Even in people like me." He looked at her then, full and steady. "Especially in people like you." The sun dipped behind the hills as they returned to the cabin. He opened the door for her without thinking, and she stepped inside like she belonged there. That night, she placed her ribbon on the shelf beside the hearth. Not because she was finished with it, but because she'd decided it could rest too. The morning they rode out toward Hattie's place, the air held the scent of turned soil and something faintly metallic from the creek running fast after the rains. Jonah had packed a small basket with a few jars of lard and dried pears as trade. Brielle carried a folded scrap of paper she'd written questions on, each word carefully printed. They cut through a stretch of ponderosa pine, the horses' hooves quiet in the needles. Brielle kept her gaze forward, not speaking until they reached the edge of a wild raspberry thicket. "Hattie," she said. "What's she like?" "Sharp as flint," Jonah said. "She keeps to herself unless you're useful or honest." Brielle nodded once. "I can manage both." It was near midday when the cabin came into view, a slanted roof tucked low against a hillside, with jars glinting in the windows and strings of herbs drying under the eaves. A rust-colored dog barked once, then retreated under the porch. Before they reached the door, it opened. A woman stepped out, face thin and wind-chapped, gray streaks woven through her thick braid. She wore a faded man's coat and held a willow branch like a walking stick. "You brought me trade or trouble, Jonah?" she asked. "Trade," he said. "And a student if you've the time." Hattie looked Brielle over with a gaze that missed nothing. "You breathe like someone who's fought for air more than once." "I have," Brielle said, voice steady. "Then come in." The cabin smelled of vinegar and dried mint. Shelves of jars lined every wall, each labeled in spidery handwriting. Brielle's eyes caught on a dish of beeswax, a row of amber bottles, a mortar dark with use. Jonah handed over the basket and stepped back. "I'll see to the horses." Hattie pointed to a stool. "Sit." "Tell me what you know." "I remember my mother steeping things when I was sick," Brielle said. "I know elderflower eases fever. I know licorice root tastes better than it smells." "Not much, then." "But enough to start." They spent the afternoon weighing dried roots and boiling water in the iron kettle. Hattie told her to watch the way steam moved when the blend was right. It should rise like breath, not boil like anger. By the time Jonah returned, Brielle's fingers were stained from slicing burdock and her braid had come loose from the pin. She looked up when he stepped in, eyes shining in the way effort sometimes brings. "She learns fast," Hattie said. "Stubborn, too. She's earned that," he said. They rode home beneath a sky streaked with gold. Brielle leaned forward against the saddle horn, watching the hills roll past. "She called me stubborn," she said. "You didn't argue." "I think I liked hearing it." Jonah adjusted his grip on the reins. "You've always had grit. That's not new. It feels new when someone names it." She glanced sideways. "You've never said much about what you want from life." He kept his eyes ahead. "That's because I didn't know for a long time." And now, he was quiet for a stretch, the only sound the creak of leather and the low wind. "Now I want to wake up knowing there's someone in the house who sees me plain and doesn't flinch." She let that rest between them while the horses picked their way down the slope. "I'd like to be that," she said softly. He slowed his mount, turning toward her. "You already are." That night, she didn't sleep right away. She sat by the window, stitching a new cloth for the shelf where she meant to keep her own jars. Not because she had them yet, but because she would. Jonah came in from checking the barn, his shirt damp from sweat and his boots muddy. She looked up. "You ever think about adding to the house?" He leaned against the doorframe. "You've got something in mind, a second room with shelves, a place that smells like lemon balm and beeswax." He crossed the space slowly, stopping beside her. "You're not just passing through here anymore, are you?" She set the cloth in her lap. "No," he reached down, brushing a loose thread from her sleeve. "Then we'll build it." She stood then, close enough to feel the heat off his skin, the scent of cedar and horsehair clinging to him. "I don't want this to stay quiet forever," she said. "Not what I feel, not what we are." He nodded once, sure and slow. "Then say it." She reached for his hand, fingers closing around his. "I love you, Jonah Ellard." His hand tightened gently in hers. "I've loved you since you gave me a place to stand." He kissed her then, not rushed or uncertain, but like a man who knew the shape of peace when he found it. Outside, the stars blinked in a sky wide enough to carry every name they'd left behind. Inside, the warmth between them settled deep, like roots finding soil. Neither of them looked back. The first frost came early that year. It crept in overnight, silvering the fence rails and curling the last of the squash vines beside the cabin. When Brielle opened the door that morning, her breath left her in a soft cloud. She wrapped Jonah's old flannel around her shoulders and stepped barefoot onto the porch. "Ground stiff," Jonah said, walking up from the paddock with a burlap sack slung across his shoulder. "We'll need to pull the last of the carrots before it sets in deep." She nodded, watching the way the frost melted under his boots. "I laid out muslin to dry yesterday, forgot to bring it in." He set the sack down and rubbed his hands together to warm them. "If it's stiff, we'll soak it for a day." "Won't harm anything." Brielle turned toward the slope where the muslin laid limp over the drying line, edges crisp with ice. "I dreamed last night," she said. He waited. "I was standing in the hallway of the house I grew up in. Everything was quiet and I was holding a candle, but the flame wouldn't catch." He didn't speak right away. Then, you think maybe it's because the past ain't lit anymore? She looked sideways at him. Maybe. Or maybe it was never meant to burn. They worked side by side through the morning, pulling roots from the earth, shaking off the dirt and laying them in crates. Jonah's hands moved with quiet efficiency, and Brielle followed his rhythm without needing to ask what came next. Later, indoors, she sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting herbs into glass jars while Jonah sanded a new shelf he'd built that morning. The old one had sagged under the weight of her growing collection. He paused in his work. "I've been thinking about something." She glanced up from the calendula petals in her palm. "What? I'm not a man for grand words, never have been. You've never needed them. But I've known a few things clear these last weeks. One of them is that I'm not meant to go back to living alone in that barn loft, waking with nothing but chores ahead of me." She set the jar down carefully. "What are you asking me, Jonah?" He stood, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "I'm asking if you'll take my name. Not because of what folks might think, but because I want to build this life with you, fully and forward." She didn't answer right away. She walked to where he stood near the window and took his hand in both of hers. "I've carried so many names that didn't belong to me, sickly, useless. Burden, but with you I feel named true." He swallowed and nodded once, eyes steady. "Yes," she said, "I'll be your wife." They were married 3 Sundays later beneath the same walnut tree where they'd sat after the preacher's gathering. Hattie came in her best dress, bringing a jar of lemon balm cordial and a shawl of her own weaving. A few neighbors came, 2 quiet folk who offered bread and hand-carved spoons, and who didn't ask for more than they were given. Brielle wore a dress she had sewn herself, the hem stitched with tiny lavender buds. Jonah had trimmed his beard and worn the only coat he owned that didn't carry the scent of livestock. They exchanged vows spoken low and sure, their hands joined between them, and when Jonah kissed her, it was with the gentleness of someone who knew the cost of solitude and the worth of its end. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, the fire banked low and the world hushed beyond the windows. Brielle lay beside him with her head on his chest, listening to the beat of his heart. "You know," she murmured, "I never thought I'd live long enough to be loved steady." "You will," he said, his fingers brushing her braid. "You'll live long and be loved every day of it." In the months that followed, the cabin changed with them. Jonah built the second room with his own hands, each plank nailed with quiet purpose. Brielle filled it with jars of her tinctures, pressed flowers, and bundles of herbs that she sold or traded when folks came calling. Word spread that she was the one to see for tonic, for balm, for grief that wouldn't settle. She never promised cures, only care. Snow came and passed. Spring rose slow and wet, coaxing green from the hills. They planted together onions, beans, and tobacco for trade. A red-tailed hawk nested near the ridge, and Brielle watched it often, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her mouth when it took flight. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she placed his hand on her belly. "It's early yet," she said, "but I know." His hand stayed still, then tightened gently. "We'll make room," he said, "we already have." By summer, she moved a little slower. He did the heavy lifting without complaint, and she filled their evenings with stories her mother had once told, her voice stronger than it had ever been. She gave birth in late September, with Hattie at her side and Jonah pacing outside, silent until the cry came. A daughter. They named her Leora Light. Jonah held her that evening beside the fire, the baby's fingers curled around his thumb. "She's got your eyes," Brielle said, worn and glowing. "She's got your fire," he said, kissing her temple. They raised her in the house they'd built with hands and time and second chances. Leora grew up knowing the names of plants before she could spell her own. She learned to ride bareback by age 5, and by 10, she could bandage a wound and braid herbs for drying. Years passed, but the cabin stood firm. The shelves never emptied and the fields never failed. They aged with grace, with laughter, with the knowledge that nothing given freely is ever truly gone. And every morning, when Jonah poured coffee and Brielle opened the shutters, they still looked at each other the way they had that first morning after the frost, like they'd stepped into the life they'd both once thought beyond reach together. Always.